If someone had told me a year ago that my life, my meticulously curated, silent, predictable life, would be irrevocably upended by the man in apartment 4B, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, of course. More of a dry, internal huff of air. My life was a library, each day a neatly stacked book filed away in its proper place. Dr. Ethan Thorne was a Category 5 hurricane, a force of nature I only ever observed from behind the reinforced glass of my own solitude. He was motion. He was noise. He was the heavy, confident tread of boots in the hallway at 3 in the morning, the jingle of keys that sounded angry, the sharp, clipped tones of phone call about someone's hemorrhaging spleen that bled through the walls. He was a physical presence that seemed to take up more space than his body actually occupied, a gravitational pull of sheer, unapologetic existence. I, by contrast, had perfected the art of taking up as little space as possible. I was a ghost in my own building, a quiet footnote in the lives of my neighbors. My world was built on routine. I was a researcher, a digital archivist for the city's historical society. My days were spent with ghosts of a different sort, sepia-toned photographs, the faint, spidery script of letters 100 years old. I found comfort in the quiet, in the order of the past. It couldn't hurt you. The present, however, was a minefield, and Ethan Thorne felt like the most dangerous part of that terrain. I saw him mostly in glimpses. A flash of dark hair falling over a tired, furrowed brow as he fumbled for his keys. The broad set of his shoulders under a worn leather jacket as he strode out of the elevator. The stark white of his doctor's coat, which always seemed to carry the faint, sterile scent of the hospital with it. A smell that clung to the air in the hallway long after he was gone. He was handsome in a severe, exhausted way. His jaw was always tight. His eyes, the one time I was close enough to really see them, were a startling, piercing blue that seemed to be assessing the world for fractures and breaks. He never really saw me. I was just a shape, a presence he might nod at curtly if we happened to pass in the lobby. The man in 4A, the quiet one. To him, I was likely just part of the building's architecture, as permanent and unremarkable as the scuffed baseboards or the flickering fluorescent light at the end of the hall. This was the distance, a wall of plaster and studs between our apartments, and a chasm of personality and lifestyle between our lives. He saved lives. I cataloged deaths. We were antithetical, and yet I watched. I learned the rhythms of his life through the thinness of our shared wall. The groan of his mattress when he collapsed into bed after a long shift. The rush of the shower at an ungodly hour. The low murmur of the television he sometimes left on, a barrier against the silence I so readily embraced. I knew he drank his coffee black. I knew he had a sister who called every Sunday afternoon. I knew he sometimes paced his living room for hours, the floorboards sighing under his restless weight. This was my secret. My one deviation from the ordered catalog of my life. This strange, one-sided intimacy with a man who didn't know my name. It was a form of observation, I told myself. Professional curiosity. But my heart, that frantic, trapped bird in my chest, knew it was something else entirely. It was a longing so deep and so terrifying that I kept it locked away in the most secure archive of my soul. A feeling for a man who represented everything I was not, everything I feared, and everything in the darkest, most honest corners of my mind I desperately wanted. He was life, raw and chaotic and bleeding. And I was just watching from the sidelines. The disruption, when it came, was not a hurricane. It was a silence. It was a Tuesday, a particularly brutal one, even by my standards of quiet monotony. The rain had been hammering against my window for 2 days straight, a relentless, percussive drumming that was starting to wear on my nerves. I knew Ethan had been on a 48-hour shift. I'd heard him leave on Sunday, his voice already frayed. I hadn't heard him come back. The silence from apartment 4B was different. It wasn't the empty silence of a vacant space. It was a heavy, weighted silence, a stillness that felt wrong. The usual sounds, the pacing, the television, the sigh of the refrigerator were absent. By evening, a knot of anxiety, cold and tight, had formed in my stomach. This is ridiculous, I told myself. He's a grown man. He's probably just sleeping. But the quiet persisted. It felt like a hell breath. Then I heard it, a sound that cut through the rain and the silence. A loud, shattering crash. Not the sound of something dropped, but something thrown. It was a sound of violence, of despair. My heart hammered against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to lock my door, to pretend I heard nothing. That was my way, the way of the observer. Never interfere. But then came a second sound, a low, guttural sob that was swallowed almost immediately. It was a sound of absolute brokenness. It wasn't the sound of the confident doctor, the force of nature from the hallway. It was the sound of a man completely undone. And just like that, the reinforced glass of my solitude shattered. I stood outside his door for a full minute, my hand hovering over the wood. My mind was a screaming chorus of reasons not to do this. He'll be angry. He'll be embarrassed. He'll tell you to get lost. It's not your business. But that sound had made it my business. I knocked, softly at first, then harder. Dr. Thorne? Ethan? Are you all right? Only the rain answered. Taking a breath that felt like inhaling shards of glass, I tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. The door swung inward on a scene of quiet devastation. A lamp was overturned, its shade askew like a broken neck. A picture frame lay shattered on the floor, glass glittering like frost around a photo of him with a smiling woman I assumed was his sister. And there he was. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the sofa, knees drawn up to his chest. He was still in his scrubs, stained with things I didn't want to identify. His head was in his hands, his broad shoulders trembling. He didn't look up. He didn't seem to know I was there. He was a fortress, and he had finally, catastrophically, crumbled from the inside out. The hurricane had turned inward. My carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The man I had kept at a safe, intellectual distance was here, broken, in his own home. And I was the only one who knew. The researcher in me faded, and something else, something more human and terrified and determined, took its place. I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, shutting out the world and sealing the two of us in his disaster. Ethan, I said again, my voice barely a whisper. This time he looked up. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were wrecked. They were red-rimmed and hollowed out, swimming with a pain so profound it stole the air from my lungs. There was no recognition in them, just a vast, empty landscape of exhaustion. I heard a crash. I said, the words feeling stupid and small. He just stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to place my face. Then a flicker of something, shame, maybe, passed through his gaze. He dropped his head back into his hands. Go away, he mumbled into his palms, his voice thick and raw. I should have. I really should have. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the thing my old self, the self from 10 minutes ago, would have done without a second thought. But my feet were rooted to the floor. I couldn't leave him like this. It felt like leaving a wounded animal to die in the dark. So I stayed. I didn't say anything else. I walked past him, my movements slow and deliberate, as if trying not to startle him. I went into his kitchen. It was a mess. A stack of takeout containers overflowed the trash. Mugs with the dregs of old coffee sat on the counter. It was the kitchen of a man running on fumes, a man who used his home only as a place to crash before the next battle. I found a dustpan and brush under the sink and went back to the living room. I knelt, carefully sweeping up the shattered glass from the picture frame. He watched me, his head still resting on his knees, his eyes following my every move. The silence was thick, broken only by the soft scrape of the brush and the drumming of the rain. I picked up the photograph. It was bent but intact. I set it carefully on the end table. Then I righted the lamp. The room was cast in a soft, warm glow, chasing some of the harsh shadows into the corners. I was imposing order on his chaos. It was the only thing I knew how to do. I saw the source of the crash then. A heavy medical textbook lay on the floor, its spine broken. He'd thrown it at the wall, an act of pure, impotent fury. As I stood up, my knee brushed against his. The contact was electric. A jolt of heat shot up my leg, and I flinched back as if burned. He flinched too, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. It was the first time we had ever touched. An accident. A spark in the wreckage. My heart did a frantic, painful flip in my chest. Calm down. It was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. I retreated to the kitchen, my pulse thundering in my ears. I opened his fridge. It was mostly empty, save for some beer, a shriveled lime, and a carton of eggs. His cupboards were no better. Cans of soup. A box of crackers. I found a canister of tea, a blend of chamomile and mint. I filled a kettle and set on the stove, the click and whoosh of the gas flame sounding unnaturally loud. While the water heated, I stood leaning against the counter, my back to him, trying to regulate my breathing. This was his space, his private, broken space. And I was in it. I was seeing the man behind the myth I had created, the vulnerable human being behind the arrogant doctor. He was just a man who had seen too much, a man who had reached his limit. The kettle whistled, a shrill, piercing cry. I made the tea, my hands shaking slightly as I poured the steaming water into a mug. I found a bottle of whiskey tucked behind the cracker box. On impulse, I added a small splash to the tea. A part of me, the archival part, registered the details. The chipped rim of the mug, the brand of the whiskey, the way his hand had a slight tremor when he finally reached out to take the cup from me. I knelt in front of him, holding it out. "Here," I said. He looked from the mug to my face, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of clarity in his eyes. He saw me, really saw me. He saw his quiet neighbor from 4A, kneeling on his floor, offering him tea. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. The man who held life and death in his hands every day was being cared for by a man who spent his days with paper and dust. He took the mug, his fingers brushing against mine. This time, the touch was less of a jolt and more of a slow, spreading warmth. His hands were large and calloused, but they felt unsteady. He cradled the mug like a lifeline. I sat on the floor a few feet away from him, my back against the opposite side of the sofa. We drank in silence. Him, his whiskey-laced tea. Me, a glass of water I'd gotten for myself, my throat suddenly dry as a desert. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows. "They lost a kid today," he said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't look at me. He spoke to the room, to the shadows. A little girl. Quel accident. There was nothing we could do. Her parents, the look on their faces. He trailed off, taking a long, shuddering breath. I didn't offer platitudes. I didn't say "I'm sorry," or "that must have been so hard." The words felt hollow, insulting. So I just sat there, a silent witness to his grief. I let the silence hold the weight of what he couldn't say. He finished the tea and set the empty mug down. He leaned his head back against the sofa cushions and closed his eyes. The lines of exhaustion on his face seemed to deepen. He looked younger and older all at once. I noticed a small, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow. I noticed the way his dark lashes rested against the pale skin under his eyes. I noticed the pulse beating a steady, weary rhythm in his throat. I was no longer observing from a distance. I was here, in the heart of the storm, and it was terrifying, and it was exactly where I needed to be. He must have drifted off. One moment he was sitting there, a statue of depletion, and the next his breathing had deepened, evening out into the slow, heavy rhythm of sleep. His head lolled to the side, his chin resting on his chest. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, but utterly spent. The thought of leaving him like that felt wrong. The thought of moving him felt like a transgression. I was paralyzed by indecision. I sat there for what felt like an hour, just watching him sleep. The city outside was quiet now, the rain having softened to a gentle drizzle. The only sounds were his breathing and the hum of the refrigerator. It was the most intimate setting I had ever been in. His apartment, dimly lit, filled with the ghosts of his trauma and the solid, breathing reality of his exhaustion. My own body ached with a strange mix of adrenaline and fatigue. I knew I should go back to my own apartment, back to my quiet, ordered world. But leaving felt like abandoning my post. I had stumbled into this scene, and now I felt a bizarre sense of responsibility. Carefully, I got on my feet. I went into what I assumed was his bedroom. The bed was unmade, the sheets a tangled mess. A pile of clothes lay discarded on a chair. It was the room of a man who didn't spend much time there. I pulled the comforter off the bed. It was heavy, a dark gray wool. When I returned to the living room, he hadn't moved. I stood over him, the comforter in my arms, my heart a frantic drum. This felt like crossing a boundary I could never uncross. But the sight of him, shivering slightly in his sleep, solidified my resolve. I draped the comforter over him. He was so tall, even folded onto himself, that it barely covered him. As I tucked it around his shoulders, my fingers brushed against the back of his neck. His skin was warm. The short hairs at his nape were soft. The contact was brief, functional, but it sent a fresh wave of heat through me. My stomach was a nest of bees. I pulled my hand back quickly. He stirred, a low mumble escaping his lips, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was waking up. But he just shifted, settling deeper into the sofa, pulling the comforter tighter around himself. He seemed to be chasing a warmth he couldn't find. I gathered the empty mug and my water glass and took them to the kitchen. I washed them, the simple domestic act feeling surreal in this context. I dried them and put them away. I tidied the stack of takeout containers. I wiped down the counter. I was a ghost again, but a useful one, setting his small world back in order while he slept. There was a guest blanket folded on a shelf in his hall closet. I took it, went back to the living room, and sat down in the armchair across from him. I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. I pulled the blanket over my own legs, switched off the main lamp, leaving only a small accent light on, and settled in to watch over him. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours of the night, I must have fallen asleep too. I woke to the gray light of dawn filtering through the blinds. My neck was stiff, my body cold. For a moment, I was disoriented, the unfamiliar shapes of the room confusing me. Then it all came flooding back. Ethan, the crash, the confession. I looked over at the sofa. It was empty. The comforter was folded neatly, placed precisely in the center of the cushions. The apartment was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a clean, empty silence. An intentional one. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. He was gone. I stood up, my joints protesting. A note was propped against the folded comforter. My name, or rather, was written on it in a sharp, angular script. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Thanks for the tea. That was it. 2 words. No, 3. Not an explanation. Not an apology. A dismissal. It was a wall, built of paper and ink, slammed right back into place between us. The doctor was back in control. The fortress had been rebuilt. I felt a hollow ache spread through my chest. I had seen behind the curtain, seen the vulnerable man, and he had promptly slammed it shut in my face. The intimacy of the night, the shared silence, his raw and broken words, it had all been a hallucination, a fever dream brought on by his exhaustion and my loneliness. I felt like a fool, a voyeur who had been caught and politely, coldly shown the door. I let myself out of his apartment, the click of the lock sounding like a final verdict. I went back to my own silent, orderly space. It felt different now. It felt smaller, emptier. The solitude I had once cultivated as a shield now felt like a cage. The books on my shelves seemed to mock me with their quiet, unchanging stories. My own story had taken a sudden, sharp turn, and now I was lost. The next few days were a special kind of hell. A hell of silence and proximity. I heard him come and go. The heavy tread of his boots in the hall was no longer just a sound. It was a physical blow, a reminder of what I had seen and what I had lost. We passed each other once by the mailboxes. He was in his scrubs, looking tired but composed. The mask was firmly back in place. He met my eyes for a fraction of a second. I saw a flicker of something there. Panic? Shame? Before he looked away. Dr. Thorne, I said, my voice sounding rusty. Hey, he replied, his voice flat, neutral. He didn't stop. He just kept walking, a man on a mission, leaving me standing there with my junk mail and a heart that felt like a lead weight in my chest. My anxiety went into overdrive. I replayed the night in his apartment over and over, analyzing every word, every gesture. Had I overstepped? Had I taken advantage of his vulnerability? The self-recrimination was relentless. I had broken my own cardinal rule. I had interfered, and now I was paying the price. The absence of him, the absence of the connection I had felt so powerfully, was a constant, dull ache. My quiet life had returned, but it was tainted now, haunted by the ghost of what had happened in apartment 4B. I tried to bury myself in work. I spent 12 hours straight digitizing a collection of letters from a Civil War soldier to his wife, losing myself in the faded ink and declarations of love and fear from a century and a half ago. But even that failed to distract me. The soldier's loneliness echoed my own. His fear felt like my fear. I had to face it. I had been lonely before, but I had managed it. I had cataloged it and filed it away like everything else. But now I knew what the alternative felt like. I had tasted connection, a real, raw, human connection, and the return to my sterile solitude was unbearable. He had ruined me. He had ruined my quiet, predictable life with one night of shattering vulnerability. On the fourth day of the silence, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, in this hallway purgatory. I needed to know. I needed to hear him say it. It was a mistake. Let's forget it happened. I needed the finality, the clean break. I needed him to formally evict me from that space we had shared so I could go back to being the ghost in 4A. That evening, I heard him come home. I heard the familiar jingle of keys, the thud of a bag being dropped. I stood in my own apartment, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I gave him 10 minutes. 10 minutes to shed the armor of the hospital. Then, with a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic bird in my chest, I walked out of my apartment and knocked on his door. The wait was agonizing. Each second stretched into an eternity. I was about to turn away, to retreat back into my shell when the door opened. He stood there, framed in the doorway. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and sweatpants. His hair was damp, as if he'd just showered. He looked tired, but not broken like before, just weary to his bones. When he saw me, his expression tightened. The mask was back, but it was ill-fitting, the cracks showing around the edges. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. It was the voice you use with a stranger, a solicitor. The coldness of it was a slap in the face, but I held my ground. "We need to talk," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of pure exhaustion. He ran a hand through his damp hair. "Look, about the other night, no," I interrupted. "Let me just say something, and then I'll go, and we can go back to being strangers who share a wall." He looked at me, his blue eyes guarded, but he didn't close the door. He just leaned against the frame, crossing his arms over his chest. A defensive posture, a barrier. "I'm not sorry I came over," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I'm not sorry I stayed. I heard you, and you sounded like you were in pain, and I couldn't just ignore it. I know it was an intrusion, and I know you're embarrassed, and I understand if you want to pretend it never happened. I needed you to know that it wasn't pity, or at least not just pity. I just saw you, and I stayed. I ran out of air, my chest heaving. I had laid my cards on the table. It was his turn to fold. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on my face. He seemed to be searching for something, for the lie, for the angle. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight between us. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, rough. "Why?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not an accusation. "Why did you stay? You don't even know me." And there it was. The question that hung in the air between us, the question that had been tormenting me for days. I took a breath. Honesty. It was the only thing I had left. "That's not true," I said softly. "I know you get home at 3 in the morning and you're too tired to cook. I know you pace when you're stressed. I know your sister calls on Sundays and you always answer, no matter how tired you sound. I know you think you're invisible, a machine that just fixes people, but you're not. You're the loudest, most alive person in this entire building, and the silence was wrong. So I stayed because the silence scared me. My confession hung in the air, shimmering and fragile. I had just admitted the depth of my observation, my secret fixation. I had just shown him the file I had been keeping on him in the archive of my mind. I braced myself for the reaction. Disgust, anger, a restraining order. Instead, I saw the walls crumble. The mask dissolved. The fortress turned to dust. All the tension went out of his body in a rush, leaving him looking utterly defenseless. He scrubbed a hand over his face, a gesture of profound, heartbreaking weariness. He started, then stopped. He shook his head. No one has ever. He looked at me, and his eyes were shining with unshed tears. I didn't know what to do. I woke up, and you were there, asleep in the chair, and I panicked. I've spent my entire life being the one who holds it together, the one who has the answers. And you saw me when I had nothing. I felt exposed, raw, and it terrified me. So you ran, I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. I ran, he admitted, his voice cracking. I ran back to the one thing I know. The hospital, the chaos, where I can be Dr. Thorne and not just Ethan. The guy who throws books at walls. A small, humorless smile touched his lips. I am sorry. I was a coward. The way I treated you, it was shitty. You showed me a kindness I haven't experienced in I don't know how long. And I threw it back in your face. The relief that washed over me was so intense it made me dizzy. It wasn't me. It wasn't what I'd done. It was him. It was his fear. You're not a coward, I said. You're a human being who hit a wall. He let out a shaky breath, and finally, he stepped back from the door. Will you come in? It was an invitation. A truce. I stepped across the threshold for the second time. This time, it felt different. It wasn't an emergency. It was a choice. The apartment was clean now. Spotless. The picture frame was gone. The books were stacked neatly. He had erased all evidence of his breakdown. But the memory of it lingered in the air, a ghost we both saw. He didn't turn on the lights. We stood in the deepening twilight, the room filled with the soft, gray glow of the city. I don't know what this is, he said, his voice low and uncertain. He wasn't looking at me, but at his own hands. I've never felt like this. The way I felt when you were here. Safe. The way I felt when you left. Like I was missing a limb. I've dated women. I always thought I was straight. My heart stopped. Then it started again, a wild, hopeful, terrifying beat. Oh, he finally looked at me, his blue eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. And then you knock on my door, and you tell me you know all these things about me. And it's not creepy. It's the opposite. It feels like being seen. For the first time ever, he took a step closer. The space between us shrank, filled with a tension that was no longer anxious, but electric. It was charged with unspoken questions and terrifying possibilities. I don't know what I'm doing, he whispered. Me neither, I whispered back. And it was the truest thing I had ever said. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment in the air between us before he gently touched my cheek. His palm was warm, slightly rough. The calluses from his work, from holding instruments, from holding lives together, were a stark contrast to the softness of the touch. It wasn't a spark this time. It was a current, a deep, slow-moving river of heat that flowed from his hand into every cell of my body. I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering shut. This was it, the turning point, the moment where the story changes forever. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It was slow. It was hesitant. It was a question. His lips were soft, tasting faintly of coffee and uncertainty. He was exploring, learning the shape of my mouth with a gentle reverence that made my knees weak. I brought my own hand up to cup his jaw, my thumb stroking the rough stubble there. I kissed him back with all the silent, stored-up longing of the past year. I kissed him with the memory of his broken sob and the sight of him sleeping on the couch. I kissed him with the terror and the hope and the overwhelming, shocking rightness of it. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We rested our foreheads together, his hand still on my cheek, mine still on his jaw. We were an island in the twilight of his living room. Oh, he breathed out, a sound of pure discovery. So that's what that was. I let out a shaky laugh. What was it? This, he said, and he kissed me again, more confidently this time, a statement instead of question. It was the start of a new chapter, or maybe a whole new book, one we would have to write together, without a catalog system or a set of rules. And for the first time in my life, the not knowing, the chaos didn't scare me. It felt like coming home. He made me dinner, a simple omelet, using the eggs from his nearly empty fridge. He burned the first one, and we laughed, a real, easy laugh that echoed in the small kitchen. It felt ridiculously domestic. Surreal. We ate sitting on his sofa, the one where he had slept, the one where he had broken. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The silence was different now. It was a comfortable, shared space, not a void. After we ate, he stood up and walked over to a small, unassuming wooden box on his bookshelf. He opened it and took something out. It was the photograph from the broken frame, now housed in a simple, new silver one. He and his sister, smiling, arms around each other. "My sister, Anna," he said, his voice soft. "She's the one who calls on Sundays. She worries. I tell her I'm fine." He looked at me. "I haven't been fine in a very long time." He set the photograph down on the end table, right where I had placed the Ben original. It wasn't an act of erasing the past. It was an act of honoring it, of integrating it into the present. He was showing me his wound, but also showing me he was healing. Later, as the city lights began to glitter outside his window, a new kind of anxiety began to creep in. The inevitable moment of departure. Would I go back to my apartment? Would we retreat to our separate corners again? Even after everything? The thought was unbearable. As if he could read my mind, he turned to me. "Don't go," he said, the words simple, direct. "A plea. Please. Stay." It wasn't a question of where. The sofa, his bed, the floor. It didn't matter. It was a question of presence. He didn't want to be alone, and neither did I. He took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. He led me into his bedroom. He didn't let go of my hand as he pulled back the covers, the same comforter I had draped over him just nights before. We got into bed, still fully clothed, and lay facing each other in the dark. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his breath warm against my face. "It's more than okay," I whispered back. He pulled me closer, wrapping his arms around me, holding me against his chest. I could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart against my ear. It was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. I buried my face in his t-shirt, inhaling his scent, soap and exhaustion, and something that was uniquely, intoxicatingly him. For the first time in as long as I could remember, the frantic bird in my chest was still. It wasn't trapped. It was resting. I fell asleep in his arms, feeling safer than I had ever felt in my entire life. The new beginning didn't start with a thunderclap, but with the smell of coffee. I woke slowly, tangled in sheets and limbs that were not my own. Sunlight streamed through the window. For a moment, the old panic flared, the morning after anxiety, the fear of finding him gone, a note on the pillow. But then I felt the steady rise and fall of his chest behind me, his arm draped possessively over my waist. He was still here. We were still here. I lay there for a long time, just breathing, committing the feeling to memory. The weight of his arm, the warmth of his body, the quiet peace of the room. This was real. Eventually, I slipped out of bed, moving carefully so as not to wake him. I went into his kitchen, and, with the confidence of a man who now felt he belonged there, I started making coffee. His machine was complicated, but I figured it out. Soon, the rich, dark aroma filled the small apartment. A few minutes later, he stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, his hair a mess. He looked rumpled and soft, and so incredibly beautiful it made my chest ache. He stopped when he saw me, a slow, sleepy smile spreading across his face. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my own smile feeling wide and unfamiliar on my face. I handed him a mug of coffee. Our fingers brushed. The touch was easy now, familiar. He took a sip, leaning against the counter next to me. "You're still here. You told me to stay," I reminded him gently. "I'm going to keep telling you that," he said, his voice serious. He looked down into his mug. "This is new for me. All of it. I'm probably going to be clumsy at it. I might even try to run again when it gets scary." He looked up, his blue eyes clear and direct. "But I'm going to try not to. I want this. Whatever this is, I'm clumsy too," I admitted. "My entire life is a user manual for how to avoid feeling things. You're a major deviation from my operating procedure." He laughed, a real, warm sound. "Good. Your operating procedure was boring, It was a joke, but it was also the truth. My life had been safe, but it had been beige. Ethan was color. He was a vibrant, chaotic slash of cobalt blue across my pale canvas. Our new life began to take shape in small, quiet moments. It was his medical textbooks appearing on my meticulously organized bookshelves. It was my worn copy of Whitman's poetry on his nightstand. It was me learning to sleep through the sound of his pager going off, and him learning that I needed absolute silence when I was reading. It was making dinner together, sharing the small kitchen in an easy practice dance. He never had another breakdown like that first night, but I saw the strain of his job, the shadows it cast. Now, though, he didn't face them alone. He would come home, and I would be there. Sometimes he would talk, telling me about his day in clipped, clinical terms, unburdening himself of the horrors he had witnessed. Other times, he would just collapse into my arms, letting my silence and my presence absorb his pain. I had become his sanctuary, and he had become my anchor to the messy, vibrant, living world. One evening, months later, we were lying on my couch, his head in my lap as I read. He reached up and took the book from my hands, setting it aside. "What was it you said that first night?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. "That the silence scared you?" I nodded, running my fingers through his hair. "It felt wrong. It felt like you'd been erased. I think I was trying to erase myself," he said quietly. "But you wouldn't let me. You just kept showing up. You swept up the glass. You made me tea. You covered me with a blanket. You refused to let me disappear." He looked up at me, his expression full of a love so profound it still, after all this time, took my breath away. "You didn't just save my life, you know. You gave me 1 inch, and in that moment, I realized he had done the same for me. Before Ethan, I was an archivist in my own life, carefully preserving a past that was safe and sterile, too afraid to write a new page. I existed, but I didn't live. He hadn't just disrupted my routine. He had demolished the lonely, fear-based structure I had built around myself and dragged me, blinking, into the sunlight. The man I thought was a hurricane turned out to be the calm in the center of my own personal storm. He wasn't the plot twist. He was the whole point of the story. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't knocked on his door that night. Would we still be two strangers, living parallel lives separated by a thin wall of plaster and a chasm of fear? It's a terrifying thought. That one small act of courage, of stepping outside my carefully drawn lines, changed everything. It makes you think about all the doors we're too scared to knock on, doesn't it? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed the trajectory of your life? My story is proof that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most beautiful, unexpected homes. Thank you for listening. And if you want to hear more stories about finding love where you least expect it, please consider subscribing.